Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, August 23rd of 2022, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 45 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. This Sunday is August 28th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And today for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, 5:30 a.m. And since it's a call-in podcast, we all shift time zones depending on our own travels from time to time. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year C, and that puts us in the Gospel of Luke on Sunday, puts us at a banquet on Sunday. We hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room, we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sarah Mickelson from Tampa.
Bill Hall, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Charles Willard, Maple Grove, Minnesota.
I'm Don Upton, and I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And our leadoff person is going to guide us through this discussion is our friend Sarah Mickelson, who's going to read the scripture too. Hello, Sarah. What's the good news?
Morning, everybody. Welcome to the dining room table. We're in Luke chapter 14. The instructions are to read verse 1 and then hop to verse 7 through 14. In the middle of this is a healing of a person who has dropsy, which back then was something to do with an unsatiable thirst. And it usually came from a person who might have had kidney disease or a person who might have had some sort of water intake and water retention problem. So from that perspective, we're going to talk about an unsatiable desire for honor in this case, but here's the scripture first. Starting with verse 1. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, and he told them a parable. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. Give this person your place, then in disgrace, and the host who has invited both of you may come to you and say, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. And then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return, and you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And that ends the reading of our scripture. Very interesting collection. Invitees and inviters, both of them are looked at cautiously and carefully. I guess to start with, it's interesting that Jesus has been accused of eating with sinners and people who are unsavory. And here he sits down with a Pharisee. Here he is. And then the conversation talks about what he sees, what he observes. So my theme this week has been around coming to a table or watching the table, standing around the table. And it made me think of the Lord's table. So I'm going to lay that out there for you. My first question is about coming to the table. In verses 1, 7 through 11, these verses offer a glimpse of guest behavior around a dining room table. First, what do the words and they were watching him closely, imply. And when considering the observed table manners and the words of Jesus, what is revealed about God's realm? And I guess that's my primary question as I'm looking at this contrast between the words that Jesus offers and what he observes. Charles, do you have any pearls of wisdom about this?
No, I don't at this point.
Thank you. Bill, what about you?
First of all, I'll repeat what I said before the recording. Thank you for these questions. They have really challenged me. They were watching him closely. I think I infer that this is meant that maybe they're trying to trap him. That is said explicitly in other places. But I took it a little differently. We are always being watched. You know, that comment, I believe it's in the book of Acts, outsiders saying of Christians, see how much they love each other. So perhaps the purpose here is that Jesus is kind of on trial, but it reminds us that our behavior matters. And I think getting to what I believe is your focal point this week, Sarah, how we deal with inclusiveness, people watch that. Now, your second question, or the second part, was what is revealed about God's realm. And I think whenever we talk about God's realm, we're talking about ourselves. Clearly, humans are portrayed as competing for power and prestige, even at a banquet. Even a meal can become a place of vying for power. And God is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ as focused on serving others. Thank you for alluding to the part of this passage that we skip over. Why it's skipped, I don't understand. But he's coming to this meal, and it's like Jesus pauses and heals a man, and then goes on into this discussion. It's like, in case you don't get it, I just illustrated how important it is to pay attention to people, particularly those in need. Now, in Luke, interestingly, there are 3 accounts of the Pharisees inviting Jesus to a meal. In chapter 7, during which the Pharisee wondered why Jesus did not discern that the woman there was a sinner and Jesus forgave her. In chapter 11, the Pharisee was amazed that Jesus did not properly wash before the meal. And now in chapter 14, we are told that the Pharisees were watching Jesus closely. So to me, Jesus is saying that dining with someone is what we would say today a teachable moment, as well as fellowship. We can learn from how we act during the meal. Now, various scholars point out the obvious link to Proverbs 25, 6 through 7 that says, do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. Assumedly, the Pharisees, as students of Scripture, knew that passage. Also, it reminds us of Mary's song in chapter 1, God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. In a word, Sarah, it reminds us that God is on the side of the least of these. And I'll end there.
John, what are your thoughts?
There's always a struggle when I read commentators on this, between the different pieces and how you put them together. And so I started with, well, what is this about for me this time? And I had 4 parts. Usually I have 2. The first 2 would be, this is about hosts who seat people. And it's about people who seat themselves. Now I've added to it, and it's about those not present to be seated, and it's about the divine taking a seat in the room. So it's about those four. And that allows the first two to flow together a little better, because the host and the guest, those are sometimes separate things. But when you have the divine taking a seat, or those missing, boy, there are a lot of people missing here. I don't think there are even women in the room, right? So a lot of people missing. That helped me. So your question is, I think, great for folks that listen in who moderate classes or run discussion groups about this. So I would say one way to respond to Sarah Mickelson is to make a list in class. You can whiteboard or chalkboard this one. You know, why are they watching? I think really goes to your first question, why. The list goes on and on. I've been keeping the notepad with me since you sent me the questions a few days ago, Sarah. And it ties together what it means to have the divine taking a seat in the room. They're watching just for fun because he is a notable person or a dignitary. They're watching because there's breaking news, or they don't want to miss anything. They're watching because it's new or strange. I think there is a strangeness here, and people are attracted to that, and they want to see it. They're watching because it's a spectator sport, using today's terms. They're watching because they want to test or looking for opportunities to test. They're watching because they're going to be storing up the information they see to tell stories in the future. Right or wrong, they're going to store this up. And of course, it's been stored up for us, for the author of Luke, to be retold. So we know there's a retelling. How many people in that room want to talk about what happened yesterday? All of them, probably. What did you see? A leader with authority, a standard bearer, has walked in the room. That's part of it. People are watching because he's a standard bearer. Or a standard bearer who could be in conflict with another standard bearer who might be the host. And then I would add to that a stranger or an outsider. And I don't think, you could add 20 or 30 other things, but I think to start a class with that written on the wall might be interesting, because it's probably all of the above and some more. Understand what it means to have the divine walking in the room. And then your second part is what's revealed about God's realm. And I'd say, looking at that list, it's an observable universe, not mysterious. The standard bearer walks in. He walks in. I can touch him. He's there. So this is a universe that is not mystical. It is present. It takes a seat, observable. It is contextual, time and place. It is accessible. I'm including the hosts and the guests. It is accessible if you choose. Depending on who you invite, the divine is accessible in that room, but who came to the party? I'll flip it and say it's strange. And it's like a stranger walking in the room. The divine comes in. We think of the warmth and the excitement of having the Christ in the room. Well, it's also a stranger coming in the room. If all the things I listed why they watch is important. I think there's a strange reciprocity taking place here that's it turns the tables a bit. And I think it's one that can only work if there's ongoing self-examination, and you're allowing the divine to reset your own table. Kind of gets to where you're going to go with the second question. Whose table? Why are the tables being flipped over? What's going on? And it flows everywhere. It is exclusive. Bill, you're talking about the obligations, the responsibilities here. But at the same time, it's not exclusive, which is part of the point that Jesus is making. So I started making lists, Sarah, and I am today still making lists. Thank you.
I thought it was interesting that tables are meeting places for people, meeting places for ideas. Some of the commentary I read talked about it was considered a norm to invite people to a dining room table to have a conversation, to hear ideas, and have people share their perspectives, especially perhaps about a particular scripture or a particular idea of the day. So it was, first and foremost, a way of getting to know someone new, or getting to know a new idea, or having a conversation around a new idea. So with that as our backdrop, it's interesting, we see the disciples jockeying for position later, closer to Passover and the glorification of Christ. But we also see this collection of people having a conversation about who sits where and what does that mean. And who are you closer to on the table, the person who hosted or the person who is the guest? And oftentimes they would be, seated somewhat oppositionally so that everybody would have access and be able to hear. So I'm curious about this. What does this reveal about humanity and the way humanity works versus what does this reveal about the divine and how the divine works? And I'll talk more about that with question number 2, but I think Jesus is showing us something, showing us a future that God holds, a table where we are invited and God will be greeting us as the host. And are we the honored guest people who will be hanging on our every word? I think being watched closely is curiosity. Being watched closely is a bit of judgment. Being watched closely might have been, we're suspicious of this new teaching rabbi and the miracles he's providing of healing. And I'm a little cautious to say that he's on our side or he's not. So there may be some of that in the watching closely. The other thing is he a magician? Is there going to be a sleight of hand, and we won't? We didn't see that before, and now we're going to see that he's a charlatan. So I think all of those reveal something about human nature. We're drawn to the spectacle. We're drawn to the things that we're curious about, and we want to understand them, be they a falsehood or be they truth. I think we're drawn to those things. So that's about coming to the table. My second question is about approaching the Lord's table, which is a little bit different. In the book of Luke, there are so many tables that are presented and set or flipped over, for lack of better language. I'll name a few: the wedding feast at Canaan, the celebration banquet for the prodigal son, the feeding of the 5,000, the rich man's table that Lazarus visits and begs for water. These are some of the tables that I thought about. And it made me think about getting married and my mother having a conversation with me about whether or not we would make assigned seating at the dining feast after the wedding. And I'm kind of not a fan of that. So I said, no, we will not be making assigned seats. Let people sit with their friends, family. So without that constraint, I'm thinking about how wedding banquets are often have assigned seating, and what insights do you hear, or does this parable prompt about how we approach and gather at the Lord's table for communion? Bill, you got any thoughts?
Great question. One of my thoughts is that sharing in communion can be an occasion to examine how we may have a sense of superiority and advantage over others. Again, the oft-repeated warning to us not to say they have this problem, but how might we participate in that? In the 20th chapter of Matthew, the mother of James and John asked for special status for her sons. In Mark 10, James and John requested for themselves to sit at the left and right hand of Jesus in his kingdom. So I don't know, but at least it's a question that I want to raise for myself. whenever I sit at a table with a meal, but especially the Lord's Supper, how am I participating in that? Also, just as Jewish people were to remember that they were once slaves and were led into freedom, so we are to celebrate our liberation through the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, and to know that that forgiveness is offered for others. Then what really came back to my mind, Sarah, when I was away at college and working on becoming a Presbyterian minister, I was a candidate for the ministry under my local presbytery in Orlando. I purposely visited a wide variety of churches, many different denominations, from high church to Pentecostal churches, and for the first time I experienced what I thought was an old custom, fencing of the table. That was a term that was once used. For example, the pastor would visit your home and examine you to see if you were worthy of coming to communion, and you'd get a token. You can still find some of these tokens in historic churches, and you had to present that token in order to approach the Lord's Supper. And what I began to experience was there were churches where when it was time for communion or Mass or whatever, it could be said, unless you're a member of this denomination, you are not welcome. In several cases, if you were invited only if you were a member of that particular congregation. And I found this shocking. Again, we need to avoid feeling judgmental and superior, but I decided that I could not participate in fencing the table, that it is the Lord's table. Jesus' instructions about actively including all persons in our invitation, I think, are particularly relevant at the Lord's Supper. And then, let's be honest, when we sit in worship, how inclusive is the congregation? Racially, economically, socially? I think we're still a long ways from the goal that Jesus offers us. Thank you for the question, Sarah.
John, what are your thoughts?
I like the concept of like advanced seating and preparation. And each year, sometimes I read it negatively, and this year I'm reading it positively. The advanced seating, there's a place for you. We do it. I'll do it in my own little universe. You know, who am I sending advanced word to? But you know, this is to your point, Bill. The intentionality of this is, you know, where are you giving a heads up? Who are you naming for the advance? So there's a bright side to the advance, which is hold that date. There is a table prepared for you. And this is a challenge to, you know, who's on that list. If you dare to host, I think there's a strong burden there, almost like a book of James kind of thing, Bill. You know, if you dare to teach, if you dare to host, I put it right there with teachers now because they're watching, right? People are watching. It's very similar to a Jamesian kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah, if you dare to do it, then who's on that list? If you dare to make a list, if you dare, then lead. What does leadership look like? So I like advance, you know, and I like save the dates because it's a reminder. There's a table. There's a gospel to the advance. Save the date, coming in March. There's a party. There's a wedding. And you are included. The dark side, which is, you know, I'm not included maybe, but I like that. I think there's a lot of gospel in it this year. And then gathering together. Sarah, that was a challenging question about bringing the communion into this. I'll take a position just for fun to say, I think this is a workshop enabled for us to approach communion. It's a workshop. If you dare. If you dare to take a seat, if you dare to host, if you dare to watch the divine, as that divine walks in the room, then this is a workshop. And the workshop's there for us every day. No matter where you're from, what walk of life. I was preparing for this poetry from the Depression era, and it's about people dining together, waiting in soup lines. And they call themselves brother and sister, dining by the river, finding some scrap of food to eat, and they still talk about that banquet of the brother and the sisterhood. So I think that it's all a workshop, whether it's the landscape of a fancy party or you're getting together over lunch. I think it's like I dare you if you host it. I dare you if you seat the table. I dare you to make a business luncheon invitation. To be intentional about all these things, because life is happening right there under your nose. You set a table, it's right there. I dare you. So I feel the burden, and then I see the opportunity too. So for the Christ, there's the past, present, and future, Sarah. This is a reminder he was at the table. The author of Luke says, I am reporting to you that information was collected. I am saying to you, this is what he did. And he walked in that room, and he took a seat. And this is what he did. He was there. And then flip to the future. He is going to be there. He is going to have a banquet in the future. And for us, here's the I dare you. He's at the table. The divine walks in the room. The divine walks through the walls. The divine is present all the time. So I've got a happy read, if I dare, to take responsibility, whether I'm taking a seat or I'm on the outside or I'm a host. And I think the danger is the I dare you is they don't want to intuit or suggest that I'm setting God's table. I think that's the trap. Is my table hospitable? But is Christ's hospitality? I don't even own the hospitality. It's all Christ's table. I can't set it. I can't make it go. I can't do it on my own unless I think through all these things. I can't do it unless I see people. I can't do it unless I think about who's being named and who might be missing. But in the end, I have to adopt the hospitality of Christ, because this is saying to me, I can't do it really well myself anyway. Not only is it Christ's table, but it has to be Christ's hospitality. I can't even get there from here. So I think for the hosts, you have to relinquish the role completely. You have to be totally giving up that responsibility in order to do a good job or have that responsibility bill that you're talking about. That's what I've been thinking about, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. All great thoughts. Charles, what about you?
Thank you for allowing me to get stuck. I'm I'm always amazed at the kinds of observations and byways and that you all find, and I'm simply stuck, and I want to draw your attention to the lines, the verses at the end. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. What does that mean? I have no idea. Where does Luke leave this? Well, he doesn't leave it. He goes on, but he says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. I guess I'm confessing my puzzlement and bewilderment here. I'm not sure what Jesus anticipated his disciples were going to do. I'm not sure what Jesus anticipated, if that was the case, when he was in the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal. This has just left me in a state of bewilderment, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I wonder about the transactional perspective of the meal that Jesus is invited to. It seems like I want to be seen with so-and-so. I want access to so-and-so. It seems all very worldly rather than divine. So I like, Don, where you took that question because it invited me to consider the gift of hospitality, because what you talked about was hospitality to me. And it seems like intentional hospitality to plan a meal and invite people. Where it goes into the weeds for me, Charles, is where you found it, because when we get to question 3 and we talk about who's being invited, it really kind of shook me to my core a little bit. And so in my observations around approaching the Lord's table, I think Jesus seems to shift the conversation to the guest list in an effort to draw the listener to consider who is beloved by God. It's not who's earned the right to sit at the table. It's a question of who's in need of the table, and who needs the connection, who needs the community to come around them, versus who needs to be recognized by the community as a leader, so to speak. So for me, it starts with, it's more about loving each other than about being obligated or in debt to each other. So I'm just, the Lord's table seemed to be the crux or the turning point, the shifting of the story in my thoughts. And it led me to asking the question, when we're setting the table, what should we consider? So Jesus shifts the focus from the guest to the host, and the instructions grow more difficult for me. What about you? How do you hear and apply these instructions that we find in the verses 12? Verses 12 through 14. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends. Invite the people who are at the margins. There is a charge for inclusion here. And my question would be, are we still talking about a dining room table? Or are we talking about the gifts that you have to offer? So that's my question. What or how do you hear and apply these instructions into your daily practice? Bill?
I appreciated Mark Davis's distinction of the invitees and the inviter. That was a helpful concept for me. And this question, all of your questions are important, but for me, Sarah, this is the most important. It speaks to me particularly right now. And I think in the lectionary passages for this week is a passage from Hebrews 13. I will quote a brief part of it, verses 1 through 3. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. I love that imagery. Not only a stranger, but an angel. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. And I will briefly and carefully allude what would happen if in leadership at all levels we dealt with issues as if we were there. What if we live in a country where there's tremendous violence and risk? Would we have no understanding of wanting to get out of there? What if we were a parent having our child taken from us? Would we not have strong feelings? This concept of, and to me it's more than empathy. And you said this already, Sarah, it highlights the importance of hospitality and inclusiveness. And I remember as a child, there was a missionary from India who spoke to us, and she powerfully said, Don't you, this was in the 50s, don't you Americans dare feel superior to India and their caste system. You think it's horrible. Do you not have caste systems in America? This was before the focus on the civil rights movement, and I still remember that. I was a young child, and she very powerfully, and we do have caste systems, which is, I think, at the heart of the current controversies over being woke, which is a concerted effort to deny the obvious reality that we have very powerful and excluding caste systems in America today. Now, a counterpoint. The lectionary script skips the following story in Luke, verses 15 to 24, the parable of the great dinner, which notes the excuses that people offer for declining the host's invitation. Okay, we're talking about being an inclusive host. Do not delude ourselves that by being kind and inclusive, everybody is going to embrace that invitation. That's just a helpful counterpoint. I don't know that that was Luke's purpose in including it, but that's the impact it has on me. Now, my final point. A scholar, I neglected to note which one, notes that in this passage, Jesus is the only one who speaks. Listeners were invited twice to speak in reply, but they did not. And for me, this may not be Luke's purpose, it's a signal that we need to listen and often not talk or argue. So I'll leave it there. The need, as one who talks a lot, I appreciate and want to embrace the invitation to listen.
You know, I do like the idea that Jesus forces us to look at the guest list and consider what's important, who's important. And from a hospitality standpoint, the question is, who are we giving this gift to? Who are we inviting to the dialogue that may not have been included before? Who are we inviting to the feast that may have stood at the outside and wished they had access to this table? I'm not a fan of fencing the communion table, just as a general rule. It's not mine to decide who gets to access it and who doesn't. And from that perspective, you know, I've told this story before, but jokingly, when I was very little, I didn't understand communion the same way I do now. And I thought that the size of the bread piece that you took indicated how much sin you had experienced that week, and that perhaps you took as much as you thought you needed. So when people grabbed big pieces of bread, I was like, ooh, what did they do? I was considering that perspective. I think I was all of 6 or it dawned on me later that communion often happens late in the morning before a lunch meal, and people might be hungry. So people are taking bread according to the size of their appetite or their hunger, which is a wonderful image because then you're taking the amount of bread that you need to fill your soul, so to speak. A little shifting of the thinking across time, which I think this table opportunity and this table metaphor gives us, that lens and that privilege to refocus and think about what does it mean to host? What does it mean to be a guest? How do you respond to an invitation? How do you respond to a host in a dialogue at the dining room table? Or how do you invite people who will fill your table with good conversation? And if I have a choice, I want to go to Dawn's house for dinner. So I like the idea that there's this planned and well thought through moment that this table, this seat has been specifically made for you. I think we get a hint of that at the Lord's table. So I think it is more about loving each other than being obligated to each other. It's not transactional. It's grace. And I'll rest there. Charles, do you got anything?
No, I mean, I find myself really mystified. Almost as though I'm listening to a completely different conversation, and I don't have any way to further define or identify that. But I'm puzzled about where y'all are and where I find myself, and I regret that, but it's where I am.
Don, you get last word?
Host two-seat people who take seats, the divine walks in a room, and then the people who aren't seated. Now, and for the people who aren't seated, Bill, you got me thinking about this, is they're taking seats. They're as fully human as anybody else in the room, and they dine together, and they have ways of connecting. It's just we don't see it. And I want to say we who are in a closed room with a group of people. But they have names. They aren't going to be made human by being invited. They aren't going to get names because the host has decided to bring them in the room. They are full-blown human beings walking in that you haven't seen before. Host. I dare you. And I think sometimes some of the shallow readings of this is they're being rescued. Or, it's like, no, they're having dinner somewhere else. And they're together. And they have names, and they call each other friend and sister and brother. Just like you do in the room that you're in. And I wanted to highlight that as I'm thinking about that fourth dimension of they're out there. So they have their own fellowships, and they have names. And I was looking at Mark Davis too, and one of the things in his translation that jumped out when he talked about, the calling out, it says, call aloud in a loud voice. Hey, Sarah, Bill, Charles, right over here. There's a naming going on. And outside the door, there's a whole world filled with people with names. Separate, individual people, not summary, not hungry people. The nameless. These are named people. You just don't know it because you are doing the you. Like the host doesn't know it because. And I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, so think about what's happening here, Bill, 60 years ago, 60, 70, 50 years ago, within 100 miles, if you draw a circle around it, people are walking into the Woolworths or other lunch counters as a family, and they're not just sitting there. They're used to having dinner together in other places, but they decide they're going to have dinner at the lunch counter. But they don't just sit there. They order. Let's talk. They pray. They sing. They talk. They come in, and they all have names, and they call each other brother and sister. There's a host, the owner, the company, and it's a shock. It's like, that's the stranger, right? Jesus, the stranger walking in the room. It's like, what is this? Who are these people? Make it more shocking. They didn't even look the same. I mean, it was like women and men and people of color and your son and your daughters with them. And, it's like, what is going on? So I'll hold that out in terms of the challenge for the American host. I dare you to serve them coffee. I dare you to call them friend. But when I saw Mark Davis, I saw, the word friend pops out, the name and friend. And the opposite of that would be they would be a pretender, which I think that's what the host, the guests taking their own seat might be. Do you call them friend? What are they? And so there's also this concept of, who's a pretender. And I am looking at the landscape of the room, which we get to go to every day in our minds, in our own homes. What is that landscape? It's a place that's prepared for us by the host. I dare you, host. I don't know about you, but I size up the landscape of a room, and that's okay because we get to look around. And I think there's a landscape at the lunch counter. There's a corporate landscape. There's an ethos. There's a landscape of the ethic in the room. What is that landscape that we're walking into? And then just like the book of James, I dare you to size up that landscape. I dare you. I dare you to do it. It's right there at our feet. We don't have to go find it. It's just right there every day in what we're doing. So I was looking at poetry, and I want to talk about The Outsider very quickly just by reading a piece of a 1927, note that, 1927 poem by Wade Oliver. Just going to do a piece of it called The Banqueters. Okay, so this is the category 4, those not in the room but still having dinner together. If you have known hunger that rends and slays, gnawing your nights, darkening your days, if you have looked on the 4 gaunt walls and envied the fly that battens and crawls, if you have grubbed in the alleys for bread and fought for a crumb and wished you were dead, if you've slunk by the river brim and wondered if bones would sink or swim, then you're my brother. Well, that ain't in the room, but that's a room too. And they have names. And so I think Depression era poetry really pops out here because everyone's dining. Everybody's in fellowship. I think everybody has a name. That's what I've got, Sarah. I know we're running out of time here, but let me pause here and see if there's any follow-up before we say goodbye.
I'm happy with this.
I'm happy reading Luke. And for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. That's where the 4 of us met, in a class. And I think maybe we had meals together because they set a table for us in that church. And we don't all live in the same cities anymore, but we get together. And we commend their site to you, which is palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, you'll find scripture readings, great sermons, outstanding music, opportunities to take communion, disagreements, meditation. So check that out. And you're always welcome. And we'll see you next time.